My name is Molly Worthen. I'm the acting faculty director for the program for public discourse. I'm also an associate professor in the history department, and I am happy to welcome you to tonight's event, which is called Can We Talk? Student Thoughts on Free Expression at UNC. And the topic of this event really gets to the heart of the program for public discourse's mission. We seek to build students' capacities for debate, for deliberation, to work on just getting better at civil discourse, both at UNC and hopefully in the wider community. Later on, you will probably hear about one of our programs, which is called the Agora Fellows Program. And it's a super exciting opportunity for undergraduates. It involves chances to do discourse and get better at it. It involves a pretty decent stipend, very exciting. So listen for that. And if you want more information on how to apply, you can find it on our program's website. I also want to thank the Department of Political Science for co-sponsoring this event. Tonight's event is inspired by a 2022 report called Free Expression and Constructive Dialogue at the University of North Carolina. And it includes some really interesting survey data from students at Chapel Hill. Some of the research is reassuring. I was glad to read that in general, our students say that faculty encourage them to express a pretty wide range of perspectives in class. But there's also a lot of room for improvement, judging from the data. I hope that tonight's program will give us a better sense of how to do that, how to strengthen public discourse, both at UNC and at other campuses. Because of course, we know that the problems that we have at UNC are not unique in this age of pretty intense polarization. We are very lucky to have with us tonight one of the researchers involved in free expression, in front of whom I am rudely standing, Mark McNeilly, who is a professor of the practice of marketing at Kenan-Flagler Business School. He also serves on the Program for Public Discourse's Advisory Committee. Before UNC, he worked in global marketing, and he has published several books, including one on how business managers can learn from Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War. We also have 4 current UNC Chapel Hill students who have agreed to join us to talk about their own personal experiences with free expression on campus. Aidan Buehler is a junior. He's a philosophy and economics double major who describes himself as having spent the last 5 years touring the political spectrum. He is also an Agora Fellow and was a research assistant on the Free Speech and Civil Discourse report. Next to him is Maddux Vernon, a sophomore who is a political science and peace, war, and defense double major with a minor in music. She is from Hillsborough, North Carolina, and is involved with the Dialectic and Philanthropic Societies and the Undergraduate Senate at UNC. Then we have Nate Gibson, who's a senior majoring in political science. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Carolina Review and is looking to go into government consulting after graduation. Then we have Cho Nikoi, who's a senior majoring in history with a minor in philosophy, politics, and economics. On campus, she's a radio DJ and business manager at WXYC 89.3 FM. She's also co-music director for the UNC Loreleis and is a very involved Agora Fellow in the Program for Public Discourse. When not in Chapel Hill, Cho lives in Dakar, Senegal, but she grew up in Italy, South Africa, and the United States. I want to give these students an extra advanced thanks for being willing to take on what's a pretty challenging and complicated topic. Now I'm going to turn it over to Professor McNeilly, who will give us a brief overview of his research and get the conversation started. And then we hope to have time for audience questions after that. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Molly. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping before we start. There's going to be an opportunity for Q&A after I moderate the panel. In the room, you can stand up and queue up behind the mic, and in Zoom, you can write a question in the question section. For students who want to get the CLE credit, there's going to be a link at the end of the session that will verify your attendance. And the recording of the event is going to be made available shortly on the PPD YouTube channel. And feel free to forward that to anyone that is interested. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about pre-expression and constructive dialogue at the University of North Carolina, which the research we did in 2022. You could forward that. So just want to give you a little bit of history of where we've been as a university on pre-expression. We have a green light rating from FIRE. FIRE is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And primarily we're focused on campuses. We got that in 2015 for not having any speech codes. We adopted the free speech principles from the University of Chicago, which have been adopted by about 80 universities around the country, basically saying we believe in free speech. Program for Public Discourse was started in 2019 by our current provost, Chris Clemens. We did our first wave of this free expression discourse and constructive discourse research in 2019, just on UNC. We also are the 26th ranking out of 200 universities in 2022 of FIRE ranking. So they've ranked all the universities. UNC is number 26 on that. Just recently in July, our trustees, so the UNC Board of Trustees, adopted the Chicago Statement and the Calvin Principle. So they did that as well as the faculty. Calvin's report, I'm not going to go into that a lot, but it basically says universities should focus on institutional neutrality. They should not take positions on issues of the day. And then lastly, just this last Friday, the faculty again passed another resolution on the right and duty of faculty members to speak and a duty to protect, duty of the university to protect those faculty members. Okay. The research, at least the UNC research, a couple things that are important here. Basically, this is interdisciplinary. You can see the different disciplines that we came from. Also had very different viewpoints on politics, but we were able to work together. By having different viewpoints, we were able to challenge each other's interpretation of the data. So that was very useful. Also want to give a special shout out to Professor Tim Bryan from the Political Science Department. He was the guy with the research chops that really made this thing possible, and probably I would say made this one of the best, most methodologically sound pieces of research that has been done in this space. Okay. We've done two waves of this. As I said, 2019, we did a wave of UNC grads. That was funded by the provost, and then this time the research I'm going to be talking to you about was the 2022 research. So we were asked by the Board of Governors after they saw the 2019 research. Board of Governors watches over all the public universities in the system to do it for 8 system universities. Since we had, you'll see in a second. That was funded by the Board of Governors and the individual universities. We just presented that to the Board of Governors in May and our own Board of Trustees in July. You can see the participating institutions, everything from App State. They went over Texas A&M this weekend. Some of the other ones, right? We work with local research partners in a lot of these. UNC specifically, the key thing I want to show you there is we had 506 respondents and an 11% response rate, which is within the industry standard. And it was representative demographically of this institution. Okay. Findings also I would add are directionally consistent across the 8 universities. So pretty much the same things you find at UNC are going to find at App State and the other universities, and directionally consistent with a lot of other research by these other organizations, right? So all the research you're going to see is pretty much on point with what you're going to see if you pick up any of the reports from any of these other institutions, except they're looking at it nationally. We're looking at it in the state. So let's get into the research here real quickly. So what you'll see here on every slide, you're going to see all the different universities. In the middle, I'm going to have highlighted our university, right? And you can see student population were self-described, identified as 59% liberal, 14% moderate, 15% conservative, and 11% who chose not to identify which they were. So that all adds up to 100%. So you can see primarily a liberal student campus. So we're going to go through 4 findings. Professor Worthen mentioned one. This is the first one. Right? Faculty generally do not push political agendas. We had a question in there really asking, do you agree or disagree that the course instructor encouraged participation from liberals and conservatives alike? So this was the percent that disagreed. So you can see even here, only about 11% of conservatives disagreed with this statement. So this was, again, a reassuring finding. What you found in this report was some things that were reassuring, Some things that I would say people, that are more liberal like, some things that were people who are more conservative like. So there was something for everybody. But big takeaway: faculty generally do not push political agendas. Second finding, though, and this is where you get in some of the issues that we have, campuses do not generally consistently achieve an atmosphere of free expression. So again, if you look at UNC, this is the percent of students that agree that this is an appropriate response to a statement that they found objectionable, right? So we gave a set of statements that would, upset potentially liberal students, a set of statements that would upset conservatives. And out of that, 16% of students said it was okay to create an obstruction, 20% said it was okay to fire a professor, kind of hit home. 11% said report a student. On that same finding, right, campuses do not consistently have this atmosphere that we want. We saw the percentage of students with various concerns. So concerned about peers, their opinions that they would have if if a student gave their opinion, right? 35% were concerned about peers, a little bit less so about instructors. So we're finding that students are generally more concerned about peers than they are instructors, and self-censored more than once, about 18%. And the third finding is that we found that students who identified as conservatives tend to have some more distinctive challenges. So the top one is the percent that were concerned if they gave their sincere political opinions, that their peers would have a lower opinion. You can see 83% of conservatives were concerned. But however, 24% of liberals and also 40% of moderates were. So it's not just confined to conservatives, but they are more concerned. The percent that were concerned about the professor having a low opinion was at 72% for conservatives, and percent of students that self-censored more than once was 54% of conservative students. So they're censoring more. We also looked to see if there was any appreciable difference between males, females, and non-binary people, and also white versus non-white. We didn't really see much difference between any of those, right? Because that was a question. Are we seeing minorities that are more likely to self-censor, or one gender or the other? We didn't see any of that, any appreciable difference. This is another one. So if you think about, hey, you're here at college, you want to make friends with people, right? These are the people that basically present, again, ideas as liberals and conservatives that disagreed with this statement. So basically about 36% of students that were identified as liberal were not willing to have basically a conservative as a friend, or 34% didn't want them as a classmate, 20% didn't really feel that they're an important part of the community, and didn't feel that the conservative faculty were an important part of the community. You can see those numbers are a little bit significantly lower, I would say, for conservative. So as a conservative, you're basically saying, okay, I'm a smaller part of the community, and if I expose myself as a conservative, then my chances for social interaction goes down. Okay, also some what we see is viewpoints of the other group, right? So liberal identifying students versus conservative identifying students' perception of liberal students. So one's perception of the other. None of these data are great, except the 80% of conservatives that think liberals are intelligent. But you can see liberal students' perception of conservative students, only 43% of them saw them conservatives as intelligent, but about 72-73% saw them as either racist or condescending. On the flip side, about almost 100% of conservatives saw liberal students as condescending. So, some stereotypes about the other group. And then this is the sort of the piece of the good news at the end here, right? So we found that students across the political spectrum did want to engage with people that had different opinions of them. So when we looked at the too few opportunities to hear liberal speakers, obviously the conservatives didn't feel that was really, there weren't enough opportunities. But when we talked about more opportunities to hear conservative speakers, we saw interest not just among conservatives, but also a significant number of liberals. And over 50% of liberals and about 2/3 of conservatives wanted an opportunity to engage constructively with their peers that had different views. And this is so Abe Lincoln, right? He was obviously president at a time of a lot of polarization. I really like this quote from him, which I think kind of talks about why we do constructive discourse, right? Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? And so I think that's kind of one of the takeaways I have here is how do we, when we engage, right, kind of get past the stereotypes and the polarization to really see the other folks as people. And I think constructive dialogue can do that. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go move to the students, but I do want to say thank you to the UNC students that participated, especially these students that are going to participate now, UNC faculty that have taken this research to heart, UNC administration, which has supported this financially, as well as our board of trustees and the board of governors. So the other takeaway I want to leave you with is that good organizations continuously improve, right? And so it takes courage, I would say, as an organization to look at where you have problems and improve yourself. And I think that's one thing that we can take away that through here and through the research that's been received, that's something that UNC is doing. Okay, I think with that, we're going to move on to now the students. So let's hear from our students. And let me get the great. Thank you. You're going to be up first. Okay, so first question for y'all is, what are your personal beliefs about free expression, constructive dialogue, and how did you arrive at those beliefs? So start with it.
I think that my interest and active interest in discourse as a concept kind of was born in around the time of the election of Trump in 2016. At that point, there was heightened discourse about feelings of safety, feelings of whatever you want to call it, in the liberal state that I was in, which was a boarding school in Massachusetts. So it was kind of a small and very concentrated population of people who were felt very impassioned about the conversation topic, and I was interested. So I kind of started watching a lot of different videos on YouTube and engaging in discourse spaces, and it just became part of my life. So I pursued it in college as well. In regards to my beliefs, I think that ultimately it's just something that's fun. I think I enjoy speaking with other people, and whether that's fighting out an idea, obviously, amicably, or tackling my own beliefs with other people to mirror me or to engage in my ideas more critically. I just think it's a good exercise, and it helps you get better at whether it's your critical thinking skills or your ability to present an argument. Yeah, I think it's just a good thing to be able to do that, especially as students in school. We're doing that every day. Yeah, I don't have necessarily strong opinions of its necessity for progress or for anything, larger scale. I think as an individual level, it's a fun thing to engage in and also an important skill.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with the fact that I think it's a lot of fun to be able to converse with people who disagree with you. I think this belief was kind of born out in high school, joined the debate team, and ever since then, it's just always more interesting being able to flesh out your ideas and kind of hear the points of disagreement with other people. Makes you think more critically about what you believe and consider different perspectives that you may have not been able to consider just because of your exposure to them previously. So I've always thought of it as not just a fun, but a really necessary thought experiment to be able to construct a cohesive worldview that is in line with reality. I think that, John Stuart Mill, he's one of the greatest people who have been able to articulate a cohesive framework for wide public discourse, and being able to talk with people who disagree with you is so important. We need to be able to have living truths, not kind of inherited dead dogmas that we have just ascribed to believing without real basis behind them, without critical analysis of them. So I personally really enjoy being able to discuss my viewpoints with other students who don't agree with me, whether it be in high school or throughout my time at college. Being an outspoken conservative has definitely kind of fostered more opportunities to talk with those people who do disagree with me in some instances. But I also think that it's an absolute necessity of the university system to propagate that type of discourse between fellow students.
Yeah, so I would really agree with both of y'all. For me personally, I believe that being able to have healthy, robust discourse, especially with people who disagree with you, whether that's politically, ethically, what have you, is one of the most important things you can develop, especially as a student, as an academic. But also, I firmly believe that it is in one's best interest and your civic duty to be able to have a conversation with someone without it getting inflamed and without automatically deciding that the other side is wrong. As I mentioned, I have a political science background. I was raised by a political scientist, so I grew up at the dinner table, learning to have discussions and how to articulate my thoughts in such a way that wouldn't offend someone else, and being able to have a productive conversation rather than a conversation where you're just trying to win. So that fostered throughout my life, into high school and now into college. I've certainly pursued spaces where I'm able to have healthy discourse with people that I disagree with. And I think it's made me not only a better critical thinker, a better speaker and debater, but also a better person who's able to approach situations with a more open mind, which I think is especially key today as things become so polarized politically and complex as social media continues.
So my experience in some ways has been a little similar to Nate in that when I was in high school, I was a conservative then, and so had firsthand the experience of being an ideological outlier, in some instances a pariah. I got interested in free expression in some ways like Cho, in that I discovered certain arguments on YouTube. I read Mill. I was very persuaded by them, but nowadays, I would say my interest in free expression, my reasons for a political commitment to it, in a more personal place. I mean, like I think everyone here, I enjoy exchanging ideas with people I disagree with. It's extremely stimulating, exciting, important too, when your beliefs on important issues change, when you start realizing you should be living your life differently or voting a different way or whatnot. But for me, at least, there's also an ethical dimension to it, where as I've gotten older and older, I've increasingly realized, in part because of personal experience, that people don't normally choose their beliefs, or if they do, they certainly don't do so freely. I mean, politically, I would be embarrassed to name the exact proportion of my beliefs that are the result of the YouTube algorithm. And, the same for this change in beliefs. And I think for the vast majority of people, your upbringing, your psychological temperament, almost everything that determines what you believe is outside of your control. So given that, I think that leads to an encouraging and empathetic and understanding approach to people with whom we disagree, because it's really about ideas and not about, oh, these are problematic people.
Good. Okay, so you talked a little bit about how you feel about free expression and how you came to those views. What has been your personal experience with free expression and constructive dialogue on campus? Yeah, so you can bounce around.
Well, yeah, I could kick it off. So I think that overall in the classroom setting, my experience has been fairly positive. I don't think that, like the study shows, professors tend to push a political agenda, although there may be kind of underlying ideologies that you can infer that the professors hold. I think overall they do a good job of encouraging discussion from all ends of the spectrum. I think the chief problem comes from campus culture, as sad as that is. You know, especially working as editor-in-chief for a conservative publication and going to refill our boxes, you see routine vandalism, you see, just a lot of kind of closed-mindedness in the sense that people associate anything that may be conservative or Republican with some of those stereotypes that we just saw a couple of minutes ago. And I think that does permeate our campus discourse to, I don't know how large of an extent, but enough of an extent for people to generate a real fear of speaking their mind authentically, which in my opinion is really the chief purpose of college, to be able to, speak what your opinions are, however stupid or however bright they may be, duke it out with other people who disagree with you. And at the end of the day, you'll be a more informed, more intelligent person. So I think it's a big problem. And I personally believe that the campus culture, in terms of encouraging people of all political ideologies to speak out and engage in those conversations, are so important. definitely think they need some work.
Yeah, so I completely agree with that take. Classroom wise, I haven't really ever seen a professor strongly push any kind of ideology. Like he said, you can certainly infer sometimes from professors, but that really hasn't been an issue. For me, the most observable issue has been campus culture and the dialogue just between students, whether that's, you know, in Lenore or walking to class or getting into an argument in class about a certain issue, but it's never perpetuated by the professor. That said, I have had a rather unique experience since I've gotten to campus. In my freshman year, I joined a literary society, the Dialectic and Philanthropic Society, DIPHI for short, which is a space that does encourage freedom, free interchange of ideas. And I have debated head to head with now some of my best friends who have very different political ideologies from me, which has been really wonderful as a tool to strengthen my rhetoric, but also really good as a tool to learn how to put political differences aside at the end of the debate and then go out for dinner, you know, together and put that aside. But that space has provided us certainly a stark contrast to non-DIPHI spaces in which it's certainly a little bit more homogenous in terms of what political groups that students put themselves into. And then when they're faced with students who hold different beliefs than them, it gets pretty ugly and not super productive, as you mentioned.
So in certain ways, I think my experience has been kind of like yours, Maddux, where maybe even more so in some ways, because I haven't even been that much in spaces outside of ones rather like DIPHI. So the majority of the time I've been interacting with students here on campus. It's been through Agora Fellows and philosophy club spaces where people who already enjoy sharing ideas and debating them tend to congregate. In terms of personally and the atmospheric experience with professors, it's genuinely been pretty good. I've never seen anyone really push an agenda. I would say it's much more common for there to be an occasional political aside, comment about Trump here, comment about climate change there, that might lead me to wonder, what sort of ideas do I feel comfortable sharing here? But certainly nothing particularly egregious. And I would say that even extends to my peers. Generally speaking, when I'm around people who I already know and trust on some sort of social basis, political tension or self-censorship, as far as I know, has not been a huge deal. Like I can be grabbing drinks with the people in the Carolina Bluegrass band and be talking about abortion with a Catholic guy and a super pro-choice girl sitting right next to me, and we're all cool because we play music together and we like each other. But at those times when it is more tense, when we're talking about issues that are difficult to discuss, race, gender, and could add to that. What I've noticed is that even when conversations in some ways go well, where there's nobody shouting, nobody's accusing, it's so hard to get over that hump of awkwardness and discomfort, and even a failure to listen. Since you can I've seen conversations about such issues where no one's shouting, no one's accusing, but everyone seems kind of tense and sort of just trading bits of speech without really engaging with each other or really feeling comfortable. But I think in some ways that can also be a problem that isn't talked about right now. Cool.
I similarly have had very positive experience in the classroom. I think it also is a testament to my professors and the department that I'm in, or the department that I'm primarily in, which are history and philosophy. I think that the people who have taught my classes, which are seminar style, which is the core of which is discursive engagement between students, not necessarily between students individually and the professor. The culture within those settings has been really great, and I think that that's also an important thing to consider if you're a student who enjoys engaging with others, whether that's debate or discussion or deliberation, what have you, that you're picking, not necessarily picking opinions, but you're picking a place that will foster that sort of discussion. I think it's hard to be maybe a student who takes STEM lectures and feel like your voice is being heard because no one's asking for your voice to be heard in your lecture. And then it's to be considered. Yeah, my experience has been positive also in the Agora Fellows with Aidan, who has been there for the past 2 years alongside me. But I will say one thing that is interesting that you brought up is the idea of the campus culture being the problem, not necessarily the professors, or I'm not sure what I'm wondering is, I'm not asking this question, you don't have to answer, but when one says campus culture, are they referring to the students and the vibe that permeates campus through the students, or at an institutional level? And the reason that's interesting to me is because in a school as large as UNC, where undergrads, I think, are 18,000, I don't think there is really a campus, a linear or unified campus culture, or any sort of unified platform upon which students can speak. There's obviously these elective spaces like Agora Fellows or DIFI or debate societies where you can choose to go in, and that's what the bottom line. The reason for being there is to engage in discussion about very specific or timely ideas. Beyond that, there are people in this school who I've never heard of. We don't have any mutual followers. We've never seen them on campus. They don't exist in my realm. It wouldn't happen at a small liberal arts college, for example, where I think a lot of these discussions also take place about free speech and free expression. But I think this idea that there's some sort of unified program, or in some ways maybe a conspiracy or whatever, I mean that pejoratively, that students together engage in groupthink against certain students, I think it's a little bit of a underdeveloped take, considering the nature of our school and the way it's structured.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that happens, a lot of the discussion we have, we tend to think as professors and faculty of like what's happening in my classroom, but a lot of what students experience is not in the classroom. It happens in the dorm, it happens, when you're going out to eat, it happens in the organization. So that's the part where I think that's an important part of where a lot of these conversations go. So a couple of you talked about potentially knowing that your professor, their political leanings, and one thing we found in the research, I didn't share it with you, but primarily about when we looked at the data, 84% of the students perceive their professors as liberal, and about 4% perceive them as conservative, and the rest couldn't figure it out. How do you know? Right, you kind of talked a little bit about some comments, but how is it that you can tell what, or you think you can tell? I can say because we don't know, but let's go back and check out what the register there is for division for. How do you know? So how can you tell what kind of gives you sort of confusing clues?
Yeah, so again, I try not to make judgments about my professors if I can help it, because frankly, some of those judgments are really taken at face value and probably have no actual accuracy. But sometimes, especially as I mentioned, I'm a political science major and peace corps and defense major, so most of my classes are like politically oriented. So sometimes it's easy to tell. They may slip up and call Trump a certain name, or like speak unfavorably of him, or vice versa with the more liberal president. The way they speak about certain international politics issues can sometimes give it away. Other times it's honestly, to put it colloquially, it's just a vibe check. I just look at them and like, I wonder what you are. The only time I've ever had like any pretty solid indication of something was my professor was playing a video in class, and it was on YouTube, and on his YouTube recommended, which is all Fox News segments. So I was like, but again, it's really nothing very solid, but it's really just my preconceived notions of what a liberal or conservative person looks like, which I'm aware isn't necessarily a productive metric.
I would say for me, it's, I also in some ways use certain stereotypes when I wonder. I mean, I don't think I ever feel certain, but often I have an idea. I think some of that comes from just knowing that on average, the expected value for professors' politics is usually going to be left of center. I mean, most of the time, I'm not even so much wondering whether my professor might be a conservative, but whether they're a liberal or whether they're a leftist. I think that I find that distinction is usually more meaningful. Some of the things I wonder about comes from just certain really strong correlations between particular beliefs. I mean, why is it that if someone is an evangelical Christian and likes guns, that they also oppose immigration. Or certain beliefs tend to cluster together, just the way our politics has become. So say a professor makes a particular comment about Trump or about climate change, whether or not it's actually true, I associate a whole bunch of other issues and certain political leanings alongside that. So, and sometimes it's just very, very transparent in the sense that I actually, the professor is politically engaged or has commented on politics, and I've listened to his comment on politics. You know, once that professor wrote a book on Trump. But most of the time it's just those small comments and extrapolating from there, knowing that odds are they probably already are going to be left of center.
Yeah, so I think that they've covered a lot of the good metrics that you can typically use to gauge where a professor lies. I think that it's definitely true that you go into a class with somewhat of a baseline expectation that the professor is most likely going to be left of center. I think that one valuable thing that you can also glean a little bit of knowledge off of are the examples the professor tends to use. For example, they're talking about corruption in politics, they're talking about views on immigration, and they won't overtly say how they feel about the issue, but you can kind of tell by the connotations of the words they're using or kind of the sources they're citing, small indicators like that. And it's important not to take it too far and, you know, assume exactly what the professor believes and extrapolate that. But if you're looking to try and gauge where a professor lies, I think that those would probably be the most common metrics to do that with.
I guess I'll just, boost what y'all were saying about professors, there being a vibe, but also I think with certain professors, it's quite intentional, the vibe that they choose to give out. That being whether they're overtly political or overtly convicted in their political beliefs, that they will find a way to weave it into classroom discussion or into their teaching method, or if they're very neutral and you spend your whole semester wondering what any of their thoughts are about anything. And that can be considered a success in their teaching, or it can be considered a deficit, depending on how you approach it. But also I think this would pass the question, but I think it's important to ask yourself why you care so much what your professor's political inclinations are, and whether that says more about you and how that will affect how you move forward in their class than them. I think you have to try and figure it out if you're trying to pin, well, they said this thing one time, and then also the climate change thing, but also, abortion, whatever the little tidbits they throw out to you are. If you have to question it, then clearly you're the one that cares. If the research was showing that generally professors aren't indoctrinating their students most of the time, and students' fears about expressing themselves openly lie more so in how they'll be perceived by their classmates and friends. But clearly students still, if that is considered a positive outcome of the research, then it would suggest that if professors were ostensibly, indoctrinating or being convicted about a belief, that it would be a bad thing. I don't think it has to be a bad thing necessarily. I think if they're able to balance it with a strong pedagogical method, I don't think anyone is hurt by that necessarily.
Yeah.
Should we hear something the self-censorship when we saw, conservatives tended to self-censor a lot, but also a number of liberals self-censor. Should we care if one group on campus is willing to speak up? Or should we not care? And if so, why?
All right, so I think that's very important if there's one group on campus that is not willing to speak up, particularly when you look at the composition of campus, seeing as it's nearly 60% liberal and 15% conservative. I think that ideological diversity and being able to duke out those various ideas, that's really one of the most important facets of getting a higher education, kind of trying to culture that critical thinking. And as the point about how, there may not be a campus culture that's distinctive with such a large school, I think there's definitely some merit to the idea that it's tough to make a generalization that's going to apply to every instance. However, I think that, us as a campus, you can kind of gauge based off your past interactions and you extrapolate that as to how you think your future interactions are going to go. Whether that's correct or not, I think that's typically kind of a human nature oriented way that we operate. And especially looking at the studies, seeing that students are less likely to befriend people from an out group as opposed to 2019. Students are less likely to even value them as a part of the campus community. I think that things like that are what makes it more likely for a small minority of students to feel as though their thoughts aren't as valued as the majority. And set aside politics, I think that writ large, that's a dangerous thing to have as a norm, that just because you're in a minority of opinions, you feel as though your opinion isn't going to be as valued, or it's going to be overlooked or shouted down, whatever it may be. And I think that those fears aren't just born out of thin air. For there to be such a substantial percentage of students who feel the same way, there has to be at least something underlying these assumptions.
I can think of political reasons, sort of as you spoke to, in the sense that yes, it's important for people to be able to debate ideas, find the truth, let's get rid of our dead dogma, all these sort of mill-esque arguments. But practically speaking, I mean, obviously, I agree that it's very important that minorities, ideologically or otherwise, should be able to speak up, have their voices heard, feel comfortable doing so. But I think the greatest value of that is actually not so much to do with the beliefs they hold or what we might gain from them, but rather just so everyone else knows that the people who hold these ideas they disagree with, by and large, are fairly normal people and are like them in a whole bunch of other respects. I mean, just to go back to conservative, or it could be liberal. When we have caricatured stereotyped ideas of what a conservative or what a liberal looks like, I suspect a lot of that has to come from secondhand representations of conservatives or liberals, people we see on the news, or just the minorities of people on either side who happen to be very outspoken. Say, oh, I can recognize you as a conservative. Oh, I can recognize you as a liberal. And because it's obvious ideologically, it's like, oh, that must be what those people are like. Whereas if people knew, and if everyone just sort of had like a little meter over their head that showed whatever political belief they happen to disagree with you on, I think most people would eventually come to realize that most people are not radical or crazy or unpleasant on account of their beliefs, that we actually have quite a bit in common, and that if people feel more comfortable sharing unpopular beliefs, we'll get a lot better at appreciating them for all the other things we have in common.
So yeah, as for self-censorship, I completely agree with the two previous answers. So my curiosity now lies in, well, how do we fix self-censorship, especially for minorities on campus? And I think one way to do that and to kind of lessen that self-censorship, especially because particularly at UNC, there's such a wide gap between the amount of people who identify as liberal and the amount of people who identify as conservative. The best way to do it is to just make these conversations normalized and know when to end the conversation once it becomes non-productive. I think far too many students self-censor because they know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, either of you, because they self-censor because they know it'll get into an ugly dogfight that may lead to them losing friends, may lead to their peers having lower opinions of them, which I don't think is productive. So I think that knowing how to have a healthy conversation, come to compromises, which I think so much of our generation is not very good at, and then leave the conversation once you realize, okay, well, we disagree and that's okay. Let's move on and talk about the football game that just happened where we whooped App State's butt. And so I think that is one way potentially to kind of lessen self-censorship, is to make it more of an okay space to have a charged discussion and then move on, rather than having all of this fallout from said discussions.
I think that, I mean, the first question you posed originally was, should we care? I think the we is ambiguous in that, clearly some people care more than others, or not care, but feel personally affected by it more than others. And that's unfortunate, but I don't think that necessarily we institutionally have to care about, and this might sound very like radical, I don't mean it in this way. I don't think institutionally viewpoint diversity needs to be like codified as a principle that we need to care about, because the viewpoint diversity is naturally occurring. I mean, I think a methodological struggle that I'm sure research that y'all face as researchers was the categories you even use on these surveys, like conservative and liberal. And I don't personally believe, like Aidan was alluding to, I don't personally believe in that those are two discrete categories of people. I think that generally, if you're saying people's ideas individually exist on this spectrum, but not people as individuals or part of a larger collective. There's no like conservative caucus and liberal caucus on campus, and the conservatives are disenfranchised. I think that we do ourselves a disservice to limit ourselves to those categories first in the first place. So no, I don't think that the idea of this like universal type of any people when it comes to viewpoint is necessarily true.
Yeah, from an institutional standpoint, when we look at UNC as an institution, one of our missions is to, one is to seek truth and knowledge. So by getting various viewpoints across, right, and having them debated, we can approach knowledge. So that's one institutional value. The other one is where we are supposed to be producing citizen leaders. That's the other piece that is important for us. And one of the things that, at least the things I read of, it's not just necessarily an issue for conservatives being able to express themselves, but if liberal students never have to essentially defend their ideas while they're on campus because conservatives don't speak up, they, back to Aidan's point, they don't have an understanding that these people are normal people, right? Or they don't also have a chance to test their ideas. So what I do want to do, and Maddux, kind of started getting into this, but this is where I want to spend a little bit of time before we open it up for questions. So I got those instructions very clearly from Molly. For the research, the significant number of students want opportunities to engage constructively with others. And so what should our university be doing, either the university itself or faculty or students, and thinking also not just about classroom spaces, but also the spaces you have outside of the classroom? What should we be doing to foster that constructive dialogue, and also push that a little bit? How do you make it cool, right? If that's even possible.
I guess to the first part of that question first, not so much the cool part, but the what could be done. I think a very easy thing a lot of professors or graduate students teaching might be able to do would be to add just a little blurb at the bottom of the syllabus mentioning free expression. We would hope that for many students, the syllabus is one of the first things they, again, hopefully read before coming to class. So when we think about the purpose of, the other sorts of things we encounter in syllabi, the mention of caps or non-discrimination, or all of these things are about either giving resources to students they need, or telling students up front, we want you to feel comfortable with who you are. So particularly for students going into a class, knowing they already hold certain beliefs, they're not the majority, I think seeing even a little thing on the syllabus there might reassure people and, let them know up front, oh no, the professor really wants there to be constructive dialogue and disagreement on these issues. Now, in terms of making free expression cool, I think a big part of that is making it nonpartisan. In some ways, I think this is ironically getting a little easier just because, frankly, I'm thinking particularly of things like the Stop Woke Act, where in addition to like your say cancellation of Ilya Shapiro, I think there's one instance, we can look at really grievous examples of violating or threatening free expression from all sides of the political aisle, which I think is making it a little easier to fix it as a nonpartisan issue that hopefully people from multiple sides can get together. Now, cool-wise, I don't know if that's probably not enough to make it cool. Maybe we could make it a little bit more of a lifestyle thing as opposed to a political project. I think a lot of people hear free speech and they think, oh, First Amendment, law, like, what are you legally allowed to say, or what should the codes be, or what should the rules be, when there's a whole nother cultural side of it, an individual side of it about like, well, how do you interact with your friends or your coworkers? And I think playing up that more and more might help it resonate with people on an individual level.
Before we go on, I just gotta do a real check here. Of all the students in here, how many of you, before class starts, read the syllabus? That's pretty good. So for you on camera, like pretty much everybody here is raising their hand, because that's a question we have perfected. So thank you very much. Kudos to everyone that reads the syllabus. Okay.
Yeah, so I really agree with a lot of your opinions. I think as for what the university could do to facilitate free discussion and free expression, I don't know that the university top down can do a whole lot, right? Because this is an issue that really is much more individual based and much more on just a day-to-day on the ground social interaction. So I think it really just comes down to us, the students, to make free discussion cool, to make it acceptable. And one of the ways you do that is by holding yourself and your friends accountable. So if you're having a discussion politically and someone says, oh yeah, those conservatives, man, they don't know what they're talking about, or some other disparaging remark, you have to be able to hold them accountable and be, well, did you listen to them? Did you really truly take the time to see if you agreed with their takes or disagreed, and why? Instead of dismissing an entire group out of hand, because that's not productive and that's not helpful. In addition, I think more people should seek out opportunities to have discourse with people they disagree with. It's been something that's been incredibly helpful for me here at UNC, and I wish everyone had the ability to go through that experience, whether you're, politically oriented, which I suspect much of you are since you showed up here, or not. Because I think that teaching people how to have productive discussions is one of the most valuable things a student can leave college with into the real world. And I think it would do a great deal for our political future, especially in America, if everyone knew how to do that.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with a lot of what's been said, particularly the part that I'm not certain that there's a ton the university can do, unfortunately. I think there's definitely a ground up type of change that has to happen as opposed to a top down, something that you can force students to kind of get into. And on that same token, politics isn't for everyone. That's fine. Not everyone has to be this uber politically engaged person. Some people are into other things, and I think that that's okay. You're not going to be able to force everyone to talk about the controversial topic of the day. And that's normal. I think that the bigger thing is being able to recognize that there is a shared humanity and you're all classmates when you hear somebody else talking about something that you may disagree with. And this really is where it comes down to the individual level, where I think that you have to have a sense of camaraderie. You have to have faith in your classmates that they're not acting with bad intentions, that maybe even if they disagree with you, they at least somewhat know what they're talking about, and kind of legitimately contend with those ideas, as opposed to brushing them off or attributing them to negative stereotypes. I think that in terms of something that the university could do, events like this are a great start. I like the syllabus idea. I think that having more controversial classroom discussions is another good thing to kind of chip away at this block. I think that a lot of the classroom discussions that occur are almost as, to use an analogy, it's like a bowling lane, and they've got the side things up so that you don't bowl into the gutter. But you don't really know how to bowl, as in how to have these constructive conversations when you're outside of class, because you have the TA or the professor there moderating everything. So I think giving students more instruction on how to thoughtfully listen to others, take varied ideas into account, and be able to really intelligently respond to them or critically examine them. I think that that's what could be done at a more classroom level. But yeah, I definitely think it's more individual. We have to work as a campus moving towards it.
I definitely agree with what you were saying, for some of what you were saying. I think that one thing that is definitely about the classroom level is professors modeling behavior. I think generally students mirror what they see their professors doing as what is acceptable how the professors are acting, how they're delivering what they have, whatever it is they think, and they mirror that, and that's how they model their behavior in classrooms. I think if a professor is noticeably not unconvicted in their beliefs, but nervous about, not nervous, but a little bit, I'll just say nervous about taking people to engage or how they engage with students, or ask for their contributions. I think students are going to feel similarly a little bit disempowered, but also faculty are humans too. And I think there's this weird, superhuman assumption we have of our professors that they should be able to leave everything out the door and they shouldn't be able to include any of their, personal, whether it's their personal life or their personal beliefs in the classroom, all those things. So definitely, I think students have to humanize their professors, but also professors have to model behavior that they want to hear from their students. And one thing I thought was interesting is, what I keep hearing is, the idea of like, you should be able to reconcile all your differences with people and then go out and have a drink after. And definitely in many cases that you'd be able to do that. But I also think one thing that would be important, going back to that kind of topic of categorization, what the categories we even use are, I think people for themselves have to be able to identify what exactly is political that they believe in and what is moral and what is economic and where are all those things distinct and where do they merge. I think if you are, if your personal belief about something that you present as political is about truly a personal moral that you have, and can be separated from the realm of like policy making, then I don't think necessarily people have to be able to see that in the conversation and then reconcile. I think that the language of like, identity is kind of tainted at this point, but when there are things that you would disown or not disown, but leave your own family for, I think the expectation that there should also be the expectation that you're able to not have to be friends with people. And also you don't have like necessarily a right to, not a right, but it's not super, it shouldn't be the most important thing that people want to be your friend. I think honestly, it would be helpful if people were just had interests that existed outside of the realm of politics, like a bluegrass band, or that can be conversation about politics and morals can be included, but they're not the thing that unifies you, and not the thing that would even elevate your common humanity, or your common interests and enjoyment. So that's basically just figure out what it actually is that you believe in, and if you don't know, that's fine, but know what your non-negotiables are and leave those maybe for outside of the classroom. You don't have to cancel people in class or not or stop the conversation, but I think you should at least be a little bit more self-aware before you engage in a space where you're going to judge others for how they engage with you.
Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do now is move to Q&A. There's going to be questions taken from Zoom. So I think Dr. Yang is going to cover those. And then if you're interested here in asking the question, you can come down, and you want them, Nora, to come down where to you, or?
Yeah, it's more people than expected, but I think we're gonna have the mic around here so people can form a queue around here.
Okay, and then are we still having pizza afterward?
We are having pizza.
We have enough pizza for everyone.
We are doing our best. They may have forgotten the napkins and the plates, but there will be pizza and maybe messy hands. All right.
So if you want to ask a question, come down here. Otherwise, we're going to start doing that. If you want to do that, and also you're going to do some questions off of Zoom. Right? So we're going to do a couple of questions off of Zoom, and then we'll hand it over to some folks who have questions too.
All right. So I'm going to start with two questions from Zoom that I think are just too deep.
Oh, okay.
Right. So the first question, I know that the study was released this year, but when was the data collected?
The data was collected, I would say, I think in the February through March timeframe of this year.
Okay. And the second question, I think this is more of looking for clarification about the Chicago and Calvin principles.
Sure.
In a presentation to the UNC faculty last week, UNC law professor Michael Gerhardt said that there are instances wherein those who make up the university may prefer the university do not remain neutral He gave an example, the once politically controversial issue of whether public universities should be racially desegregated. And so are there contemporary examples of controversial political issues on which you believe the university, in accordance with its mission and values, should take a clear public stance, promote free speech? And so am I right that like
Are they asking, do I believe that, or do the Calvin and Chicago principle?
I think it might be helpful here to clarify what the.
Yeah, so just so you know, so University of Chicago is known as, it's a private university, known as probably the leader in free speech. Fire did their rankings, they're like number one, or did number one for, ever since Fire did the ranking. They have two foundational documents. One is the statement of principles on free speech and expression, which basically says faculty and students have the right to free expression on campus. Basically that's a fundamental right of those of all those students. And essentially no opinions are not allowed. So that's the University of Chicago free speech statement. The Calvin principles, less well-known report that deals with institutional neutrality. And so the difference there is that the Calvin report is all about the university not taking a position on matters of the day in order to allow faculty and students not to feel their speech is chilled. So for example, if the university were to take a position on issue A or issue number one, right? And they said, hey, the right position is A. If you are a faculty or student who believes in B, right, you may feel like you cannot safely speak up because you're going against the administrators in the university, right? So by essentially forcing the institution not to take a position on the issues of the day is to free up the faculty and students to speak more freely. So the basic foundational idea behind Calvin is the university is not the critic of society itself, it's the faculty and students themselves are the critics, and the university is the host of those people. That answer the question. Okay, great. Another question.
All right. What does a conservative student at UNC believe that defines them as conservative, and vice versa? What makes a UNC student liberal?
Maybe I feel like you should take first crack at this since you're here representing the conservatism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the guiding principles of Carolina Review, although it's labeled as conservative and libertarian, is more so being open to people who do feel somewhat disenfranchised, the people who do feel like they have to self-censor. And we take in a lot of writers who, they may not feel comfortable attaching their name to their work. And just as a study found, I mean, it's not that the self-censored ideas are things that are supremely controversial or bigoted or discriminatory, things of that nature. So I think that there's somewhat of an ideological diversity that we're continuing to try and foster at our publication. So I'm a little bit hesitant to kind of draw firm boundaries on, what you should be to be considered a conservative on campus. But I mean, certainly just in the classical definition, it means that, a lot of progressive ideals are trying to change status quo, and conservatism is trying to preserve it, or at least, encourage caution in changing what status quo norms are. So I don't want to get too specific on like each topic because I don't want to define what people feel they need to believe to qualify as conservative or libertarian, whatever that may be, but I think that's a good overall rubric.
And so we're folks. We're ready for questions.
If I was speaking, okay.
So one of y'all mentioned this idea that there's this cluster of beliefs that we often infer instead of like forming our own like individualistic belief systems. We often go with what party ideologies are in general. So do you think this is dangerous? And if so, how do we confront this on a college campus? And this is a question more so for the student panel, but it's also open to the professor as well.
So in some ways, I think making these quick judgments or judgments based off of stereotypes or very limited information. In some ways could be solved by addressing the very problem that you're talking about, where if people don't generally feel comfortable expressing all of their beliefs, you have a smaller and smaller sample from which to guess what their beliefs are. So I don't know if that would necessarily, how well that would translate to professors, since maybe you could say professors should not turn their class into the time to share every single political opinion under the sun, but generally speaking, especially with students, the more comfortable people are that sharing what they actually believe, the less will rely on limited information and stereotypes to guess what they might be.
Yeah, so to compound that, to clarify, you are speaking about like, you know, if I identify as a liberal, but I hold an idea that may not fit in with that definition of that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about,
Okay.
like how you can have your own individual beliefs that don't necessarily conform to party ideology.
Yeah, so this is tricky, isn't it? Because it's one thing to go against someone, you know, say you identify as a liberal and you're having a disagreement with someone who identifies as a conservative. Well, that's easy to do because you supposedly just disagree on a large number of issues of them. But what happens when you disagree with someone who's in your friend group, who's in your ideology? I think it really, again, just comes down to individual and group accountability. You know, you can discuss with your friends, your group who you generally agree with, but may not always disagree with, that, hey, if one of us has a different opinion, we can't immediately jump down the other's throats because it wouldn't make us very good friends, very good peers, and it certainly wouldn't do anything for strengthening our own rhetorical beliefs. So that's the only solution I could think of. It really just does come down to individual accountability. And that said, I think having different opinions than your primary political or whatever ideology is actually a really great thing.
Yeah, just to expand on that a little bit, I definitely agree. I think that it should be more normalized to kind of take pride in the fact that you differ from what your in-group ideology may promulgate for one specific thing. I mean, I don't think that buying into a whole narrative is necessary to consider yourself X or Y. And I think that it's important when you're talking with other students, as difficult as it can be sometimes, to refrain from generalizing and extrapolating based on one of their views, what the rest of their views are, and trying to teach or trying to look at, you know, individually what they believe topic by topic. I think that's definitely something that could use some work. And I mean, it's just a difficult phenomenon because people, they enjoy just psychologically feeling like they're in a group, everyone agrees with them. And it's easy to kind of castigate people who step out of line. So I think that, you know, like Maddux was saying, it really comes down to individual accountability and as a group trying to be more empathetic and understanding. And this goes back to what we've been talking about the whole panel, that you need to have a relationship outside of politics with people and recognize, you know, your shared humanity before you can really fully respect and consider all their political ideas. I think that's the basis that we're describing.
And I think that when considering your own political affiliations or beliefs, I think we all generally need to like humble ourselves a little bit in the belief or the expectation that we know why we think what we think. And I think generally we need to interrogate our own experiences and our own like the conclusions we seem to have come to out of nowhere a little bit more. Personally, my own political development has been really amplified and made a lot more fruitful by admitting to myself when I actually don't know about something and looking it up. I saw a video with someone talking about how when you actually asked people who were like vehemently against or opposed to Obamacare, what Obamacare was, most of them couldn't actually answer that. I think that was just an example of something, an example of obviously Obamacare is a very explicit policy, which you can read up, you can find the answers if you need them. When it comes to maybe a little bit more ambiguous or amorphous beliefs, or maybe for philosophical or for some people religious, you don't necessarily know where it came from. But I think you have to start with some self-interrogation first, and also a little bit of you have to rid yourself of your pride and know that you just don't know things.
Yeah, so a couple things, I mean, to your point, right, so there's been these little videos where they'll ask people on the street, like, hey, are you a conservative or a liberal? And then they'll ask them, like, you like Obamacare or do you like the Affordable Care Act, right? And the conservatives say, like, I like the Affordable Care Act. The liberals say, I like Obamacare. And they're the same thing, right? So, it's pretty interesting, right? So it's a little embarrassing from that standpoint. I think to your point, Aidan, you know, there's a couple of points that were made about where do we get our ideas from. So Carl Jung, who was a psychologist and just had a lot of varied interests, he said something that's kind of always stuck with me is people don't have ideas, ideas have people, right? And so the idea, you know, we think, oh, we have all these ideas that we came up with. It's like, well, not really. Ideas tend to have followers, right? They grab people, and all these people take that idea and they think they thought of it, they think they bought into it, but it's really the idea has them. And then the last, so that's something you got to be careful about. Like, do I have this idea or does the idea have me? And I guess the last thing I would say is that kind of helps us to think about the value of conservatives and liberals. When I think about both of those, I think both groups have value, right? So liberals will push the society to question why are things the way they are, right? How can they be better? What needs to change? How can we change it? And that's good, but then sometimes the things that get changed, right, can create a lot of issues that maybe we hadn't even thought about. Conservatives, their value is, hey, we know there's things that the society has created over hundreds of years that we got to be really careful about throwing out, right? And so they're going to look at what do we need to conserve, what do we need to be careful about changing. But the downside with conservatives is they can end up defending things that really need to be changed. So there's value that both bring to the table, but there's also problems that each have based on their viewpoint of how of either defending the status quo or changing the status quo. Next question.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, as an institution that is approximately 1/3 graduate students, as a graduate student myself, who's concerned about your public discourse, not us, do you have any data or understanding of the health at sort of an aggregate level among that third of students here at UNC?
No, we don't. Would we like to do it? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just a matter of bandwidth and everything else. I would, you know, I don't want to, I mean, unless I have data, I can't say that it's there. I would guess it's fairly similar. There is, depending on the graduate's age, you know, a difference. I think there's probably among younger students more of a digital focus, right? And the fact that, hey, if something happens in the classroom, they might be more willing to go put that on social media, which then creates a number of issues there. That's probably one difference, but I would say the things that we're seeing on campus are happening through society, right? The only thing that's different on a campus is A, we're supposed to be able to talk about this stuff, and B, unlike society, we are predominantly liberal, right? Now we are like society in that you go to certain places and they're predominantly liberal, other places are predominantly conservative, so we mirror that. But we are not reflective of society, so that's a little bit how we're different. But I would say the things that you might guess would be if somebody said, "Hey, you know, your money or your life," right? What would it would be? I think a lot of the things you saw are similar because we see that throughout society. I mean, the stuff you're seeing here is echoed through research I've seen, but people in the public, not just other students.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have another.
Surely there are more questions. If I bring the mic to you, will you ask a question? All right.
Raise your hand again.
So my question is about the data. I noticed that a few of the slides said that it was only based on 36% of respondents that said they had taken a politically oriented class. So do you think that may have affected the results of the survey, since that does narrow the group a little bit? And then those people might have certain interests that, say, like STEM majors who never really took a political class. Do you think they may have had a different perspective, or do you think it also might not have mattered?
Well, so what we tried, so a lot of the other research that is done doesn't specify, it just basically asks about their experience in general. So one of the things that we wanted to do with the research was to get more specific and really hone in on those political items. And so the way we did it, and this is getting a little bit nerdy, but we had student lists, like what were the four to five classes you took last semester, and then we would randomly pop one of those classes out, and then they had to answer questions specific to that class, right? Which made them focus a lot more on, you know, the actual thing they had, the experience they had in that class versus just generally in the year. It does reduce the sample size, but again, I would say a couple things. One is we're seeing that the same responses across 8 different campuses, many of them very different. You know, we had an HBCU in there. We had one that was primarily American Indians, like Native American. We're seeing the same results in the, you know, the fire research, heterodox academy, Knight Ritter. So just generally.
We have 10 minutes remaining. Why don't I collect a couple of questions and then we'll turn it over to the panelists for answering those questions, using them to make your final remarks.
We got some Zoom questions.
Oh, we do.
I think, yeah, right.
Okay, well, I'll take it. Okay, raise your hand. Yeah.
Thanks. I have a question, particularly for Cho. And so in the North Carolina Policy Watch article that was like publicizing this event, the reporter talked to a few people, and people that were maybe on the panel, I think, and maybe some other people. And he engaged mostly, it seemed like, in interviews with like substantive topics, but he identified Cho like in particular as just being Black. And then like that was all her little blurb was about. And so I was wondering what you think about like how these identity politics, like descriptors, either help or hurt this like discourse that we're having.
Right. I mean, I think to the journalist's defense, he didn't just say Cho was Black and then call it a day. He did add some more context of our conversation. So I mean, it was, you know, we had a long conversation, it was a fruitful conversation as well. But I definitely, that was something I noticed. And it was frustrating initially because, you know, before kind of reading through the rest of the article, it kind of feels like a very identity politics box that you've been put in, that because you're Black, you must, you know, these list of ideas must follow suit, which is, you know, limiting. But I think to be sympathetic to journalists, I was previously a media major, so I'm sympathetic to y'all if there are any here. I think that every journalist has, in some ways, spin that they're trying to put on an article or trying to make something new of a topic. Honestly, I think this conversation that we're having today is not new. It's the fact that it's based, you know, this current iteration of research is coming back to something that was studied 2 years ago, shows that it's not new. And I had these exact same conversations that we're having today in high school with, I remember the young Republican head of that club. We had this exact same conversation about viewpoint diversity, whatever. You're always trying to add something new to the conversation or something a little maybe sensational, but mostly trying to create some sort of analysis. And I think what that journalist was doing in his article was questioning whether that's something that should be considered, the fact that I was the only Black person in this panel, and also representing a more progressive perspective. If, you know, however we were chosen, you know, to sort of represent the student body, I was you know, it could come across that I was sort of like a caricature, which, you know, as doing sort of like meta-analysis, it would be so annoying to say meta-analysis to do that. I was a little frustrated when I thought about it. I mean, he represented the words that I said, and he placed it in a larger conversation about something I think is worth discussing. Also, generally, we're discussing that in the public discourse realm generally. Who are the people that are coming to this conversation? Who are the people who are electing to contribute to these surveys also? You know, I'm not a statistics person, but is it statistically sound, you know, to base off of people who are volunteering, because they might have more convictions about something, I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Joe, about, so one of the things we did on the research was we had a $10 incentive, because what you end up doing is the folks that are, you know, if you don't give an incentive for people to fill out the survey, you are going to get the people that are either, you know, most excited one way or the other. are most interested in the topic. We got, I don't know, probably time for maybe one more question, but I also want to mention that there will be, for those of you on Zoom, an informal or optional anonymous survey that's going to pop up on your screens pretty soon. So we encourage you to take that. That gives DPD some great data that we'd like to collect. And then do we want to do one more question from Zoom?
Yeah, we have two really good questions.
Okay, go.
I'm gonna ask them both and people can respond to whichever they prefer. The first one is in terms of institutions being hesitant about taking stances on issues. Is it okay for institutions to take a stance on democracy? And it's like, we support democracy. We think other regimes are not great. And the other question, and this has come up a bunch in the on Zoom, how do you reconcile the need to address and take action against dangerous ideologies such as racism, anti-Semitism, with free expression? Is there a point at which free expression ends and the need to remove ideologies from public forums where the public interest begins? And these are both quite great questions, and I think you have 5 minutes and you can choose which fits you. And I think I'm gonna start over here, starting this way, right?
What was the first question you think about institutional for like democracy? It's always funny. It's like we're not a democracy, we're a republic. That's kind of an inside political joke. But yeah, so if you look at the Calvin report on institutional neutrality, what it talks about is essentially the institution can talk about things. People in the administrators in the institution can take a position on things that fundamentally affect the institution. And I would say probably in this case, and a lot of these are judgment calls, universities see themselves as creating citizen leaders in a democracy. So I would say, yes, that would be something that they would take a position on. That is something that they would probably take a position on. Depends on when you say take a position on, would they take a position on Trump's electoral fraud thing? Is that covered, or is it more just democracy?
Do you mind repeating the second question? Or just rephrase it?
Yeah, the second question is about like, are there some positions, right? This free expression is sitting towards the institution.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are natural limits in some ways on your free expression that the collective will ensure, they'll work on it, the institution won't come for you, your people will react to what you say. But I mean, the first thing I think of is a student recently writing an opinion piece for the Daily Tar Heel in a critical opinion piece of students who go to Israel for prospective Israel trips. And that article was eventually taken down at the student's own request because certain students felt that it was, certain people, I won't necessarily say students, felt that it was anti-Semitic, and other people, maybe who were also of that belief, went as far as to send death threats to that person and to send death threats to that person's mother. And that's a UNC student right there. I mean, the Daily Tar Heel is an independent publication, student run, but it is an institution of the school that the school claims. So I think in those cases, when you can argue all day for the right of people to be offended by that piece, but I think students should be protected when they are the victims of actual threats to violence to them, to their person, to their people, and that I don't think is necessarily defensible.
Yeah, absolutely. In that regard, I mean, there should be no connotations or overt suggestions of violence towards anyone with, a relatively mainstream viewpoint that you disagree with. I think that some of this is naturally handled by like the Overton window, what's the realm of acceptable discourse on campus. So especially like I mentioned before, the study was not finding that students are self-censoring over highly bigoted or discriminatory views. So, if you're thinking, well, yeah, you shouldn't just go around saying racial slurs, I don't necessarily think that's the main subject of conversation in this conversation. However, Yeah, I think that you have to react poorly to certain things. Obviously, if someone's out there saying openly very bigoted things, then that's a problem. However, I think that sometimes there can be differences in interpretation based on your worldview upon what you think is acceptable or not. So I have the general inclination towards you should critically contend with ideas no matter how bad you think they are, because otherwise I don't think it's a learning experience for the person who holds that bad idea. It's more so just a dismissal of them, and that doesn't solve the actual root of the problem. So I think that we have to be diligent about understanding what are dangerous ideas. We don't necessarily want someone going around promoting ideological fascism or things of that nature that are not very constructive, but you also, I think, still should contend with them and thoughtfully point out why they're wrong, or else who knows if they're going to have the opportunity to have an interaction like that in the future.
Yeah, really quickly, because I know we're basically out of time. But I think compounding that you should always engage with someone who is talking, not always, but if you feel prepared to do so, you should always engage with someone who has a rather bigoted idea, because when it comes down to it, those beliefs generally are not rhetorically sound. They cannot back them up with data. They cannot back them up with anything other than anecdotal evidence and opinions. So I think that would help that person ideally to see that, their way of thinking is wrong and unacceptable. And also think that would help to self-regulate, whatever group you're in. I've had experiences with someone that's gotten up and said something that was just blatantly racist, and we self-regulated, and they, didn't come back and didn't espouse those beliefs again. So yeah, it really just comes down to dealing with it calmly, asking them why, asking them to prove, because at the end of the day, those beliefs just can't hold water.
We have time for. Yeah, I mean, I would largely agree with everything Maddux said. Maybe put more explicitly, rhetorically speaking, I think expressing a certain amount of tolerance, not endorsement, but tolerance and being willing to listen to people with reprehensible ideas is going to be a better way to change their minds. Not even so much because the ideas don't hold water. Unfortunately, I don't think the water holding of our beliefs is really what convinces us to abandon them ultimately. But just listening to people is a way to build trust, and until you have that, no one is going to change their mind about anything.
I just remember when we had dinner together, you said you had a high tolerance for crazy, and it allows you to interact with different folks.
Great for politics, weird for my social life.
Yes, I'm sure. Okay, so some closing comments. First off, very much thank you to the panelists for sitting here and taking questions and doing some very, very thoughtful answers. I think you presented yourself well. You spoke well for the university. I'd like to thank the audience for being great participants and for being here to engage. There is pizza, so don't forget to join us for that. And for those of you who want to get CLE credit, make sure you click on the CLE link for attending. Anything else? Thank you.